I left the Hunter Valley early in the morning, driving through Bylong Valley Way, a winding road full of valleys and hills and bounded on both sides by cliff faces. It was about 30 degrees, and after not even 2 minutes I was totally drenched in sweat inside my textile jacket. Leaving the zipper open let in a merciful breeze, but even so, it was going to be about 5 hours riding to reach Lithgow. The riding itself was sublime, the curving country roads giving enough space to be able to pleasantly carve through the corners, and the views made up for the blistering heat. I passed vineyards and horse studs on the way into the Blue Mountains. I was entering the Great Dividing Range, a thick swath of mountains that cut along the eastern coast of Australia from the far northern tip of Queensland all the way down to Melbourne in the south. The few weeks before I had left, we had a good week of rain, and the valleys and paddocks were about as green as I've ever seen them. The scenery slowly changed from the usual low hills of the bush and farmland of the northern tablelands to mountainous undulations. This was the sort of scenery that I craved as a kid, deep mountains and pine trees. Exploring these mountains now as an adult on a motorcycle invoked a strong sense of nostalgia for the holiday trips I took with my family to the snowy mountains in the summer. Most people prefer the mountains in winter, when snows cap the tallest peak, but summer brings a sort of wholesome emptiness, a relief from the ennui of working. This is far away from tourists and crowds, and while there are sporadic travelers, most of the people you'll see on the roads are probably locals, or people returning from elsewhere after Christmas holidays. I travelled from the 29th of December until New Year's Day, and most pubs were open but deserted. And they are really worth a visit. Many of the buildings in these mountains are old sandstone dating back to colonial times. Their thick stone walls keep the inside cool, and often the windows show stunning views down valleys or of bushland. You'll see one-room churches, scarcely bigger than a studio apartment, built for a congregation of only a handful of locals, maybe 100 years ago. You won't see very many new buildings if you drive through the Blue Mountains. Unless, of course, you're looking at the ultra-luxurious homes of the rich, who sometimes buy properties in the Blue Mountains as a getaway from the city. The Blue Mountains are so named for the blue haze that can be seen from the highest peaks while looking out along the valleys. From Pearson's Lookout, you can see along Capertee Valley, which is apparently the second largest canyon in the world, 1 kilometer longer than the Grand Canyon. This was my first real motorcycle trip by myself, and I learnt a few really important lessons. The first being, always make sure you have a spare clutch lever on you. About an hour past Oberon, I broke the clutch lever clean off my bike. I had just left Jenolan Caves and was working my way towards Wombian Caves, where I had planned to camp for the night. I was riding down a mountain road which was fairly steep. I rounded a really tight hairpin turn and I felt the luggage on my bike shift slightly. I was afraid that my cheap Chinese saddlebags had torn, so I stopped on the side of the road to take a look. I was at the bottom of the hill and put the kickstand down on my bike. The bike was facing downhill at a very slight angle, but there was gravel on the road. As soon as I got off to take a look at the luggage, I felt the bike shift forward, and before I could grab hold of the handlebars, the whole thing toppled sideways. When bikes are loaded up with a lot of gear, they become pretty unmanageable and seem to just want to fall over. They tend to tip easy, and once they start going down, unless you're a powerlifter, there isn't much you can do. The bike fell on the left side and the clutch snapped in 2 places, leaving only the stub of the lever holding the clutch cable. Luckily, there was a couple coming out of the campground down the road who saw me and helped me get the bike back up. I didn't have mobile reception and they didn't either, but they said there was a campground just down the road and some other people who might have reception. I started up the bike in neutral and pushed it into first, jolting forward as the gears kicked in. I rode down the road to the campground where the people told me they didn't have reception either, but one of the guys told me how I could still ride. It turns out even if you don't have a clutch, you can still shift gears. You have to really kick the gear into place and it isn't pretty. You rev the bike until the point when you would normally shift gears, then back off the revs a little bit. Push up on the gear shift and the gears should just click up. Your gearbox isn't going to thank you, but it will get you where you need to go. When you're in the middle of nowhere, at least you can crawl along in second or third gear until you get to a town with a mechanic who might have a clutch lever. I headed off down the road with the intention of getting somewhere with reception and calling roadside assistance. After getting to the next town, I realized that Goulburn was my best bet and started riding the 50 kilometers to Goulburn. After arriving at a caravan park a few hours later, I met a guy who said his buddy might be willing to sell the clutch off his bike. We haggled a price of $30, which was almost twice what you would pay for it new, and they drove off, coming back about 40 minutes later with the clutch lever. It didn't quite fit, but I could put the clutch cable into it and rest the base of the lever on the handlebars and get just enough leverage to pull the cable. At this point, I wasn't going to be choosy, and the next morning I rode to a local bike shop where they actually happened to have the right model of lever that fit my bike. It wasn't exactly the best experience, but I think this taught me a really valuable lesson about being prepared. This wasn't something I had actually thought about. Having a bike that was as loaded down as my bike was, it was almost an inevitability that I was going to drop it at some point. And whichever way it fell, it was more than likely to snap off the front brake or the clutch lever. Or without the clutch, the bike doesn't run. You can handle the bike okay without the front brake. It's a little bit dangerous, but it's still going to run and you'll still be able to ride. Without the clutch lever, however, you're in real trouble. As I said before, you can shift up to second and maybe even third, but it's not really ideal, and if you're a really, really long distance from the nearest place, then you're going to have a bit of a problem. In Lithgow, you can visit the remains of an old smelting furnace, which is now the centerpiece of a public park. The furnace ran from 1907 to 1932 and was used to supply iron and steel for the train tracks being built through the Blue Mountains. The rooms themselves almost look like a medieval castle, and the pigeons and magpies that perch in the upper windows add to the effect of some ancient ruin. Only one of the main buildings still has four walls, although the roof is long gone. More interesting to me than the furnace was the story of the migrant workers who were brought in to work in the abysmal conditions in the furnace. 120 Italian immigrants came to Lithgow to work in the blast furnace, often doing the worst jobs. This is where it gets interesting, however, because later 20 Maltese also migrated to join the workforce. The other migrants didn't like this and went on strike to protest the new migrants, who they were afraid would do their jobs but for less pay. This strike ended in a riot and police holding off an angry mob from storming the blast furnace at gunpoint. Those who didn't strike were pelted with rocks by the strikers. The Lithgow Mercury, the local paper, reported this new migration of workers as a, quote, Maltese invasion, no doubt stoking the fear of unemployment within the workers. Next place I visited was Jenolan Caves. Jenolan Caves are the oldest known open cave system in the world. The caves follow the Jenolan River, which in addition to the above-ground river, has 40 kilometers of multi-level underground passages. Over 300 entrances to the caves have been discovered. I toured the River Cave in particular. The River Cave follows an underground river. The water system has been named the River Styx, and other parts of the caves have also been named after ancient mythology and biblical stories, such as the Pool of Cerberus and the Temple of Baal. Until 1923, the only way to access the River Cave was by boat. You'll see some really interesting cave formations. Apparently, a fast-growing stalagmite will grow a centimeter in 100 years. The minaret, a stalagmite, is about 120 centimeters tall. There are some really otherworldly formations called helictites. These formations are stalactites, but instead of growing downwards, they branch out in random directions, giving the appearance of a blackberry bush. Our guide described them as stalactites having a bad hair day. According to my guide, no one really knows how helictites form, but there are theories. Helictites only form far underground, and so some speculate that this far underground, water condenses on the cave wall rather than dripping. So as a result, helictites form randomly in whichever direction the water decides to condense. Jenolan Caves also has this really stunning blue lake. The lake was formed by a weir for a hydroelectric scheme. I couldn't find any info on why the lake is blue, but I assume it has something to do with minerals that are present in the water from the cave system. After I broke the clutch off my bike, I headed to the nearest large town, which happened to be Goulburn. Goulburn is on the Sydney side of the Blue Mountains, and since I was pretty much completely through the mountains, I decided to take it easy for a day before heading back to Canberra. I decided to explore St John's Orphanage, which is a derelict building that is fairly easily accessible. St John's Orphanage was in operation from about 1913 to 1978. The main purpose of the orphanage was to deal with the increase in the population of orphans after World War II. After World War II was over, the population of the orphanage steadily declined until it was deemed to be unnecessary and closed in 1978. After that, the orphanage became the base for an organization called Youth with a Mission until 1994. The orphanage has been abandoned since then. The population of the orphanage peaked at 200 in World War II. Over 2,500 people overall lived in the orphanage throughout its period of operation. Reports from orphans who lived at the orphanage vary. Some people say that there was a lot of severe punishment and beatings and abuse from staff and older boys at the orphanage. Other orphans have said that they have very fond memories of the staff at the orphanage. Regardless of that, the conditions of the orphanage were pretty dire. Most children were issued with only one set of clothes and often had shoes that didn't fit. The orphanage taught religion and agriculture, and most of the children who came out of the orphanage had an education in agriculture and were able to work in that industry. The orphanage is now heritage listed. During 2015, a fire burned down most of the roof of the orphanage. Then in 2016, two other fires destroyed much of what was left. The orphanage originally had 3 stories, although the fire has destroyed much of the second story. It looks like it can be accessible, but I wasn't brave enough to trust the derelict staircase and try and ascend to the second floor. Unfortunately, at this point, the place was so wrecked that when I was there just really isn't a whole lot to see. But photos from the past 5 years showed that it was actually once quite a fairly well-maintained building. After visiting Goulburn, there wasn't much left for me to do other than get on my bike and follow the Hume Highway all the way back to Canberra. The purpose of this trip had been to test the waters for a later trip that I was planning at the end of January in 2019. I wanted to ride my bike all the way from Sydney down the New South Wales coast through Victoria to the Great Ocean Road. I calculated that this would probably take me about 2 to 2.5 weeks to do and then be able to come back. And I wanted to do a short trip in order to see what kind of things could go wrong or how I should possibly pack my bike, what things I needed and what I didn't. And I think this trip was really successful in giving me some insight into that trip. I'm planning on making a similar video to this video on that particular road trip, so that should eventually be on my channel.